Uncle Dan.
Hey!
If there's one thing we've learned on this show is that...
And there isn't.
Truly. Sometimes otherwise intelligent and smart people can believe in quite silly things.
What?
I myself have fallen for the reverse mortgage 3 different times.
Oh, my God. Yes, there are many things. And sometimes when you travel, you learn about such things. And I traveled to a place and learned about something that Uncle Mark's going to tell us about. And here's how I learned about it. Apparently, there's a road that I was on that they didn't destroy the rock to make the road straight. They curved the road around this dumb rock that would have been easy to get rid of. And there was a reason why. And I think, Uncle Mark, you can tell us what that reason is.
Well, before we get to civil engineering,
okay,
I think by some miracle, I might actually have found a topic today that does not specifically involve Nazism or racism.
Hey!
Either by design or in practice, I think. And I looked around quite a bit.
We're done. We're done.
I went to the dark web.
The show's over.
It's over.
But I think we're in the clear, but just so you know, I can't keep this up every week or probably ever again.
Right.
Because we've discovered at nearly 450 segments on religions old and new, large and small, you can't build a belief system or much of a religion without a god, without a good solid foundation of garbage race theory based on backwater Iron Age folktales or whatever their regional analog is elsewhere in the world.
Right.
So let's enjoy this brief respite from the slime that lives under most of the rocks of faith and belief in the supernatural by, ironically, talking about some supernatural things that live in the rocks.
Right.
Not under them, and seem not to be racist at all. Just very private. Travel with me, dear uncles, to what is geologically the youngest nation on Earth, but one just old enough to have some silly and delightful folktales all its own, that nation being the land of fire and ice, the gorgeously beautiful and very enigmatic island nation of Iceland.
Woohoo! Love that place.
It's a fantastic place. Being one of the last...
I'm the only one who's never been there.
It's
Sucker!
Really? Well,
no, I've never been.
It's time to go. I think they actually have protocols for COVID.
Oh.
So being one of the last settled, uninhabited land masses on Earth, Iceland is not only young as a geological form, but super young as a home to humans, who first settled this empty wilderness in just 874 CE, when a Swedish chieftain named Igor Arnarsson and his gang of merry men became its first permanent settlers. It should be noted that a few Scandinavians in the years just prior to that had been there for a little while, but had not stayed permanently. But he was the first to call it home. I don't know if you guys have been. Doug, you haven't. Dan, now I know you have, but it is an incredible place. I didn't know what to expect from Reykjavik, but as a capital city, it feels kind of like a cozy, medium-sized ski town.
Yeah.
You know, it's like Aspen, kind of.
Yeah, totally.
Everyone we met was absurdly nice and spoke flawless English.
And also, can I just say, gorgeous?
Yeah,
it is.
Was that your experience? Because
it was a bit crazy. Yeah,
it's part of Scandinavia, so you're gonna have that, right?
Gorgeous people.
I had just come from Sweden, and we got to
which
Iceland.
is a land of ugly motherfuckers. Let's just be honest.
Oh yeah, horrific.
Yeah.
No, it's a land of Gap models in Sweden, and then we got to Iceland. And literally there was a moment where I was sitting across from Andrea, my wife, and my friend Dave was sitting next to her, and my back was to the window, and I watched as Dave and Andrea's eyes
just darted around.
Just glided along with every passerby, and their mouths just both hung open. And I was like, come on, this can't be, they can't be that beautiful. Oh, my God.
Yeah, I have never felt more ugly in my life.
Well, Mark, this is a story for another day, but when Mark and I, once upon a time in another life, had left, we came out of Soviet Russia. Literally, this is a true story.
Yeah. Right.
We came out of Soviet Russia
in its collapsing days. It was just literally in the winter falling the fuck apart.
Yeah, and you know, malnourishment and was rampant,
poverty,
and of course poverty and you know, orthodontia hadn't really reached the Soviet bloc yet, and we came out of that into Finland, into Helsinki, and same thing.
Yeah,
it was every woman looked like a perfected being, and every man looked like Thor.
Yeah.
We were in like elf. It was an elf country. It was so fucking crazy. And they had like electricity the whole time. It was pretty nuts. So yeah, people, they speak flawless English. They were very eager to chat or offer directions or advice, or even to embarrass us about their superior knowledge of our country and its history. Jesse and I ended up at a party there one night, and this like 20-year-old kid was sitting on a couch talking about the Federalist Papers. I'm like, I got to get out of here. So technologically, what with their harnessing of their abundant geothermal power, etc., they seem like kindly Norwegians from the future. But almost in contrast to their advanced tech, they also seem way more connected to their landscape than your average American is here. It's a surprisingly big and empty country with just 300,000 Icelanders living at home. And they're mostly concentrated on the southern coast with almost no one in the great cold expanse of the middle. It is an amazingly green place in the summer with thick moss covering the endless fields and hills of basalt and black volcanic rock. The very dramatic North Atlantic is obviously also an enormous presence in Icelandic life, as are active volcanoes and other geothermal activity, and of course earthquakes, the bizarre extremes of months of darkness followed by months of daylight. It's a strange elemental environment that is as close to being on another planet as I've ever felt here on our beautiful flat Earth.
Totally.
Yeah, it's so otherworldly. And that eerie landscape and its mysterious forces might explain the Huldufolk, the traditional Icelandic belief that there are people who look and act pretty much like us, living mostly invisibly inside the rocks and the landscape of the island. Huldufolk is Icelandic for hidden people, and they are not the only invisible inhabitants of the island. Folktales include fairies, trolls, dwarves, and elves as well, who are called Alfar in Icelandic. But I'm more interested in the Huldufolk than the sort of sillier Tolkien-esque menagerie of trolls and fairies. But it seems like Huldufolk and Alfar, or elves, are words used interchangeably when referring to the hidden people. Descriptions of the appearances of the Huldufolk, in the rare instances people have claimed to see them, vary, as does their scale. They have been described as being from a few inches to several feet tall, to being proportioned normally as humans, unlike a little troll or something like that. But also to favor 18th or 19th century Icelandic fashion, which you should totally Google because it is quite charming. I think I might begin dressing thusly myself. It's very cool. They're said to raise invisible cattle and sheep at their matching scale. They marry and have children. They go to church, etc. They've always generally been seen as fairly ambivalent to human affairs, but can be mischievous or even dangerous if crossed. They're said to be extremely territorial and will fuck with anyone who disrupts their homes or invisible sheep and cow grazing. How to explain the belief in these strange, scalable, invisible Icelanders? Well, first let's look at the current level of belief in them, which is a bit hard to pin down. A widely cited survey was done of Icelanders in the 1990s, claiming that as much as 50% of them had some level of belief in the Huldufolk. This survey has been attacked, though, as being done by outsiders who had some vested interest in putting their thumb on the scale. A more recent poll is interesting, but also a little odd. It had 7% of modern Icelanders firmly believing in the Huldufolk, and 10% firmly stating they do not exist. But that leaves like 80-ish% of people somewhere in the middle, which is pretty damned odd to me. Even a solid 7% believing is pretty high in a very advanced, highly educated country like Iceland. The fact that tons of people are like, well, I don't know, I mean, maybe, is a little bizarre to me. You know, maybe it's like the Icelandic Pascal's wager. Why not just believe on the off chance it's true?
Right. Yeah.
So, how to explain the origin of the Huldufolk? Well, the Christianized version goes like this, and it'll make as much sense as the Christianized version of anything. Adam and Eve were knocking around the Garden of Eden one day.
No.
Once upon a time.
Once upon a time. So almost 6,000 years ago. They had, in this weird story, loads of children, and Eve was busy trying to get them all washed up while Adam was doing whatever his stupid ass got up to. And then they heard God was shortly arriving for a little visit. In a panic, Eve hid the unwashed half of her brood so as not to be embarrassed when company came over. So God rolls in and checks out the scene and asks if they don't have more children, knowing full well they did. Eve was like, nope, this is it. And because God doesn't like being lied to, he declared that what can be seen would remain seen, and what is hidden shall forever remain hidden. Boom! The creation of the Huldufolk in a place the writers of what became collated into the Bible had no idea existed at the time. And the moral of this story is, don't lie to God about the number of children you have. He's not Child Protective Services, as he's demonstrated time and time again. So,
oh, that's true.
Everyone clear? All right.
That's funny.
But the first people who settled Iceland were not Christians at all, but pagan Norsemen with their profusion of gods of war and love and wisdom and war again, and plenty of lesser trickster deities, etc. Their polytheism saw human attributes behind the cruel and random forces of nature. Iceland, with its barren vistas and twisted volcanic formations and steam hissing out of the ground all over the place, would have been kind of a spooky place for anyone who believed in meddling supernatural forces. Yeah. So populating it with invisible people certainly made sense. And the population thing here is also really important. This is really interesting reading. The Viking explorers and seafarers had never come upon a totally unpeopled place before. Some historians think that their culture was so identified with conquest and feats of arms that they weren't psychologically equipped to take a place without a fight. And they may not have been able to believe that so huge a landmass was totally empty. In short, it freaked them out.
Yeah.
So inventing the Huldufolk as some sort of halfway measure helped them make sense of this bizarre new land, maybe.
That's funny. It's like that scene in Life of Brian where he tries to buy that thing at full price. Yeah. And he has to haggle for it.
Yeah, and the guy's like, no, there's no other way to do it than haggling. So as far as the fairies and the other wee creatures, the Norsemen brought Irish slaves with them. Oops. Almost made it through without racism or slaves, goddammit.
Damn it.
Oh, well, it was more than 1,000 years ago, I'll allow it. And those people long had legends of fairies and little people on the edge of human perception, so the presence of Celtic slaves likely contributed to these stories. Iceland has not always been as prosperous as it is now. For much of its existence, Icelandic society hung on by a thread. Summers are amazing but short. Were you there in the summer, Dan?
Yeah, I was there.
Oh my God!
Like sort of really close to midsummer.
It's the craziest experience, isn't it?
Yeah. It's I'll tell you this: if you're a photographer, you got to get up that far north because magic hour lasts for like 12 hours.
Yeah,
it's crazy.
It gets a bit dusky, and then it's day again.
Yep.
So the summers are amazing but short. The winters are brutal, dark, and very long. The land is not terribly generous for agriculture, and nothing was really there for them when they arrived. Add to that they were always way too far from help from their ancestral lands. So the stories of the Huldufolk, from the most dire of times for the regular folks, have them witnessing the hidden people having banquets and parties with plenty to eat and drink. Later, when the austere form of local Christianity imposed a centuries-long prohibition on dancing, something Icelanders traditionally love to do, the stories of the Huldufolk banquets featured wild dance parties that went long into the night. So for people living on the freezing, dark knife's edge of existence, the Huldufolk's plenty and fun was probably, an aspirational parallel society.
Right.
Like a fantasy space where your mind could wander off to as you tried to go to sleep on an empty stomach yet again. So even today, in this highly advanced country, there are holidays that nod to the Huldufolk. On Christmas Eve, many Icelanders still clean the house up and leave out some food so the local Huldufolk can come and have a party once everyone's in bed. And on New Year's, some people put out candles outside as traditionally this is when the Huldufolk move to new dwellings, and that will help light their way. Again, it's Pascal's wager. It never hurts to curry their favor, even if you're not super sure they exist. On January 6th, called Pretindin, or 13th night, the last night of Icelandic Christmas, people make bonfires called Alforbrennur, or elf fires. And on Midsummer Night, a tradition holds that if you stand at a crossroads at midnight, mischievous Huldufolk will appear and try to tempt you with gifts, which you must refuse for unspecified reasons. So avoid that if you can, I guess. So it may be that many Icelanders don't always want to talk to outsiders about the Huldufolk and the trolls, etc., because maybe they find it embarrassing and silly, and outsiders definitely pester them about it. I did when I was there, but that's kind of my shtick. Check out my podcast if you want to know more about that. But then there's this the strong impulse to draw as many tourist dollars as possible.
Yeah.
So they pump up the idea of the magical invisible folk by creating a touristic Icelandic kitsch. And believe me, there is so much of that for sale there. But my hunch is that Icelanders are super proud of the nation they've made out of one of the most hostile places on Earth, and the very idiosyncratic culture that developed there over centuries with very limited resources and little outside contact. I have to think they embrace the Huldufolk as part of that totally unique space they've created at the edge of the world, even while they fully embrace modernity more happily than most places do.
Yeah.
And where that modernity seems to run most afoul of the Huldufolk is, as Dan mentioned, in civil engineering. Even to this day, oddly in one of the world's most dramatic landscapes with towering rock formations and cliffs, the Huldufolk tend to live in fairly unremarkable mounds or smallish boulders, according to the pain-in-the-ass people who claim to be in contact with them. So several times in recent decades, objections have been raised to the route of a new road or a highway that would overrun a random, unremarkable rock. And they literally are almost always completely unremarkable. In a land of very remarkable rocks.
Yeah, totally.
So the Icelandic agency in charge of road construction has been pestered by the foreign press about this so many times. They have a standard press release they send out every time this comes up, basically saying they respect their traditions and folkways and will make reasonable accommodations to the concerns of the locals when planning for roads or bridges. Recently, a woman insisted a 20-ton boulder laying in the path of a road was a Huldufolk church, so the government moved it. Icelanders have swarmed a NATO airbase demanding to see if the Huldufolk habitations were being respected. And an American aluminum plant was forced to scale down the size of its factory over concerns for the hidden people. So there's that. And one could easily speculate, this is kind of where I come from with a lot of this refusal to state a belief on this, is that some modern Icelanders, like the ones who stormed the base or forced the scaling down of the polluting plant, for them, maybe the Huldufolk are an avatar for a fierce environmentalism and a folk excuse handy for trying to protect their amazing landscape and environment. You know what I mean? It's like, you can't convince an American company to protect the environment, but if you come up with some religious reason, right? You come up with some folk reason they don't understand, they kind of have to back down. So, and if that is the case, I say, Lengi Lifi Huldufolk. Long live the hidden people.
Yes.
Oh, I mean, and it's, I have never been there. I've heard about this and read about this a bit. They're really they're a bit cagey about it, but they're sincere, pretty much, right?
Well, you did what was that story you did a couple years ago about the Anasazi corn god, and all we know really about him is what the Hopis told us.
Yeah,
and you're like,
right.
Well, it's entirely possible the Hopis are just completely fucking with us. Right. Which I think is kind of wonderful. And I think the Icelandic kind of ambivalence about this might be something similar to that. Right. It's a little bit of, go fuck yourself.
Right.
It's not your business.
It doesn't seem to be, it seems benign. It seems fairly harmless.
I really looked for harm in this, and other than some really terrible tourist trinkets that people probably pay way too much for, I just don't see it.
Nah.
Well, more of that, please.
Yeah. We'd be out of business as a show if people would just have harmless dumb beliefs instead of what they do. Yeah,
this is almost a first for us, right? I mean, it's actually, rather than harmful, quote unquote supernatural belief, it seems to actually be beneficial in a way, because it has been employed to protect the environment. So
that's great.
If people want to come up with environmental superstitions and things to make the world a better place, I'm all ears.
Well, there
awesome.
You go.
Yeah, that's the Huldufolk, the hidden people.
Well, let's hide them back up again and move on.
Let's do it.
Slightly diverting or moving on around them.